So, first off, this is a presentation that was written for a longer time slot, and I'm losing some time at the end of the regular DFIR time slot because we have some important community business to take care of. So, I will say that there's a couple of things I'm going to just skip over in this presentation, but the full slides and notes and everything are available from my website right now. But what are we talking about today? So, I'm kind of known for doing Linux forensics, and being known as a Linux forensics person, I, probably see more Linux forensics cases than the average person. One of the most important artifacts that we look at in Linux forensics is the bash history file, which is, of course, user command history. And it occurred to me as I'm doing these investigations that I knew a lot about bash history and how it worked, but I also had a lot of questions, right? I sort of felt like my knowledge about bash history wasn't complete, and I just wanted an excuse to just sit down and figure out once and for all the kind of life cycle of the bash history and answer some of these outstanding questions. And then, as I was doing this, I'm like, I had all of these weird, wow, really? Is that the way it works? Huh? What? Huh? And I realized I didn't know as much about bash history as maybe I thought I did. And so that got me thinking about the title for this presentation, which is, the game show format. You don't know jack about bash history. So let's do it. We'll do it as a game show, right? I've always wanted to be a game show host. It was, one of my life goals. And so here we go. So let's talk about, the basics of bash history, right? So bash history lives in a file, in your home directory. It's called .bash history. And what happens is, when you start up a shell, the command shell reads in your current bash history file to populate your history so that you can go back and search and rerun previous commands. When the shell exits, and it turns out that exit is a slippery term here, as I discovered during this research, but for some value of exit, when the shell exits, what happens is the exiting shell reads in the bash history from disk, then adds to the end of it any new commands that were entered during that shell session. And then the whole thing gets truncated to, there's an environment variable called hist file size, which is the number of lines that go into your bash history file. So it gets truncated to that many lines and then dropped back to disk, okay? Which has some interesting implications. So some important things to remember about the basics of bash history. Hello? Okay. Oops. All right. Wow. Okay, let's go back. Wow. Okay. Right. Moving right along. So, one thing is, the commands that are in the active shells, right, the commands that you've typed into the shells that are currently running in your Unix environment aren't on disk, right? The only place those commands exist right now while that shell is running is in the memory of that process, okay? So if you take a disk image of a system, you don't get the commands from the running command shells. You just get whatever's been flushed to disk by shells that have exited. Also, the order of commands in the bash history file has not necessarily anything to do with chronology, right? Because commands are written to the bash history when the shell exits. So you can have, blocks of commands from shells all out of chronological order. I may start up a shell, 10 hours ago, type a bunch of commands into it, but if I leave that shell running and I run and execute a bunch of other shells, those ephemeral shells, command history gets dropped into bash history, and then finally, if I exit that long-running shell, any new commands from that shell get dropped in after all of the other ones, right? Which is, confusing to a lot of people who are analyzing bash history. Also, the nature of the way bash writes the bash history file is that the data blocks that made up the old bash history file don't get overwritten. Every time you drop a new bash history file, you're dropping it into new unallocated data blocks, which means there tend to be a lot of older bash history copies floating around and unallocated on your systems, right? So even if somebody's doing anti-forensics and clearing out the current bash history, you'll still find remnants of older bash history files floating around and unallocated. And so I want to do a quick demo that demonstrates some of these things, just to sort of make this visual for you. So flipping over into my Unix machine. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. First thing I want to do is I want to show you sort of the current state of the bash history file for my user account. So we'll do an ls-i on my .bash history file. Okay. So it's inode number 133.71491. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a little sleuthkit action, because you know I'm all about the sleuthkit. So we'll do an istat on dev mapper for that inode number. So I want to just show you what the current block allocation for my bash history file is. All right, so you can see, you know, the basic information about my bash history, but down here you can see that the blocks that this thing currently occupies are, you know, 90, 91, and 92. All right? Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to open two shell windows, right? So we'll make this a little bit bigger so you can see what I'm typing. Let's actually do it as a different window. Okay. All right, so just to prove a point here about chronology, echo, I am typing this command first, right? And so in this shell, I am typing this command second, right? Okay, but I'm going to exit the shells in the reverse order, right? So I'm going to exit command second shell first, and then I'm going to execute, exit this one second, okay? And if I tail my bash history file, you can see, right, they went in the order that the shells exited, not the order I typed them in, right? And there's no timestamps there to tell you which one actually happened first, right? You have to infer that from other artifacts. Okay, but the other thing I wanted to show you is, I want to show you that the blocks are changed too, right? So my original bash history file was in blocks 90, 91, and 92, right? So the inode number doesn't change when bash history drops again, but the block numbers do. So if I rerun the same istat command, right, you can see that now, you know, it's blocks, you know, 9, 10, 11, I think. So, yeah, so what about the old blocks, though, 91, 90, you know, 90, 91, 92? Oh, they're still there. Nothing's overwritten them yet because I've barely used my system. And I could go back and recover the original bash history from those blocks, right? So the question is, how do you carve for it, though, right? Because you've got this sort of generic text file, right? And you need a pattern to carve for to find the old bash history files. So just as a note, I will tell you that a good pattern to carve for, cd space /, right? Think about the number of times in your command shell you type cd space / you know, var log or something like that, right? So it turns out that you know, basic Unix commands like that, cd / ls space / ssh space, things like that are, you know, good markers that you can carve for and unallocated to find these remnants of bash history floating around in your system. And you'll be very successful at pulling back chunks of bash history that way. Okay, so you get the basic idea, right, about how this works? Okay, let's do some quiz questions, right? It's game show time. So, all right. And feel free to shout them out. So, in my shell, I RM my bash history file, and then I exit the shell. What's in bash history on the other side of that? Yeah, right. I mean, so it's basically any commands that I typed in the shell where I did that RM, including the RM command and the exit, but possibly also commands preceding it. Right. So yes, so you've basically removed any past history and you only get the history for that shell, which is, sort of an anti-forensic technique. What's interesting about this is, okay, great, but what if I, rather than removing the bash history, which is, pretty obvious, that you've truncated the file, what if I edit the existing bash history file? Change commands in the bash history file to say, cover my tracks, commands that maybe I shouldn't have been typing. So I clean them up a little bit by editing the bash history file. It's just a text file, right? So if I edit bash history and then exit the shell, are my edits going to be preserved when the new bash history file drops? Yes, they will, because remember, the algorithm that bash uses is to read in the existing bash history file off of disk, whatever that is, append the commands from my current command shell, and then truncate to hist file size lines. So yeah, so you can go back and modify the history, and those modifications will just be carried forward from that point on. And integrity attacks are always more dangerous than denial of service attacks, right? So yeah, I can manipulate bash history just by editing it like a text file, which is interesting. Okay, now we talked about, the bash history file is only written on exit. And it has to be sort of a normal exit, right? I understood that, right? I mean, if you kill -9 the shell, it just goes away and doesn't have a chance to write bash history. So what I did, I was curious about, what constitutes a normal exit for bash history as far as, getting written to disk. And what I was surprised by is how few different ways there were of exiting a shell and getting the bash history written. It turns out that there's only a very limited number of ways that you can get bash history written out to disk. So the normal, exit commands, Control D, exit, and log out if it's a login shell, right? Those are, the ones we see most often. But it turns out that beyond those, there's actually very little else that causes bash history to be written. So you can kill a shell, you can send just a normal kill to the bash shell, and it will write bash history on the way out. You can also hup it, you can send a sig hup to it, the shell will die and write bash history. No other signals cause bash history to be written. I mean, there are literally dozens of different signals that you can send to processes in the Unix environment, and the only two that result in bash history being written are normal kill, which is sigterm, and sig hup. That's it, which was surprising to me. And I went through every single possible signal, and I was like, wow, really? Okay. You can nuke the, if you're logged in via SSH, you can nuke the person's SSH process, the bash shell will close normally and write bash history. So even if you kill -9, the parent SSH process, the bash shell will still write bash history, okay? And if you exit your Windows or shut down the machine, some of the shells end up writing bash history, but not all of them, as it turns out. So on my typical desktop, I'll have at least half a dozen different terminal windows open. And if I shut down my system, some of them will flush their bash history to disk. At least 3 in my anecdotal testing, and sometimes up to 6 or 7 will manage to write their history into the bash history file, but I won't get all of them, typically. And I think what's going on there is there's a race condition, which is all of those exiting shells are trying to dump bash history at the same time, and some of them just clobber each other. So you don't get the history from some of the shells. But you will get some of them. I found no other way to write a bash history file other than the things you see on this slide, which is really surprising to me. So no other exit conditions that I could find caused the history file to be written, which was a fascinating result to me. Okay, so based on that, so I open up a brand new shell window, but I don't type any commands. I just hit Control D to exit the shell. Does bash update bash history under those circumstances? Yes or no? Who says yes? Who says no? Who wouldn't raise their hands if I said purple? Okay, so it turns out that bash is actually smart enough not to bother to write a bash history under this circumstance. If you just close the shell without ever typing a command, it says, I don't care, and it doesn't update bash history at all. So that was interesting to me. Okay. Now, in typical Unix environments, SSH uses this feature called privilege separation. What that means is that there's a master SSH process, the thing that's listing on port 22. It forks a child process, a root-running child process, which in turn forks another process, which is the thing that's owned by your user ID that runs your SSH session. Okay, so I mentioned that if you kill that SSH process that's owned by you, that's running your session, you get a bash history. So here's a more interesting question. That intervening process, the parent of your personal SSH process, if I kill that, do I get bash history written to disk? So what happens if I kill the root-running sub-process that's running your personal SSH session? Do you get a bash history file written or not? You say yes? You'd be wrong. So it turns out that what happens is your personal SSH process just keeps running, and then so does your shell, and you don't get bash history at all because the process is still running. Haha, trick question, sorry. Okay, so yeah, so if you're on a live system and you want to get bash history from the process of a logged-in user, don't kill the root-owned SSH process at the top of that process tree. Kill the one that's running their session, the one that's owned by that user on that particular TTY. That's the way to get bash history to drop. Right. Now, the thing about bash history files on disk is that by default anyway, there are no timestamps, right? Well, that sucks. But thanks to the volatility developers, we can get timestamps from the bash history of shells in memory. And, more excitingly, we get all of the commands. Remember I said if the command shell is still running, you don't see the commands that have been typed in that shell until the shell exits. But with memory analysis, I can interrogate the memory of the running bash processes and see all of the command history, including the commands that have been typed in the shell. Now, what's interesting about this, take a look at the example on the slide. You can see that in the first several lines, the timestamps are all the same, 22, 50, 33, right? Okay, that is when this shell started and read in the bash history file from disk. The minute you see the timestamps changing, so down there at around the echo, this is the first command I type in the shell, right? That is the first command I typed in the shell. And you can tell because it's the first command that has a timestamp that's different from that baseline timestamp when the command history was loaded from disk. So we see when the shell started, we see the first commands that were typed in that shell and so on. Okay, so that's really useful. So memory analysis for the win, definitely, but I want timestamps in my bash history. So there's an environment variable. All right, so if I just look at my command history by default, I just see a list of commands without timestamps. But if you set hist time format, then the display changes and it actually shows you the timestamps on the commands in whatever time format you want. However, setting hist time format also changes the format that the bash history is dumped in. So when you've turned on hist time format in your shell and you look at the output in bash history, all of a sudden these new comment lines appear. And those comments are epoch timestamps, right? Number of seconds since 1970, which represent when that command was executed. So hist time format not only changes the display output, but it actually saves how that information, changes how that information is saved in bash history. Cool, right? But of course, this isn't set by default, so you never, in the wild, I won't say never, but rarely in the wild do we actually encounter this format in bash history. Okay, but let's say, we have history turned on. Some interesting behaviors that you see. Okay, so I'm in a shell and I'm typing commands and then I set hist time format. And then I exit that shell, updating bash history. What does bash history look like? Do I get timestamps on the entries from shells where hist time format wasn't set, right? Does it go through and it populate all of the bash history with timestamp entries, or just the entries from the shell that I just exited? Anybody know? Yeah. So it turns out that the answer is everything that didn't have a timestamp still doesn't have a timestamp. You only see timestamps on the new entries from the shell where you set hist time format. Okay? So you get this hybrid file where some of the entries are timestamped and some of them aren't. This is why it's probably better to set hist time format in something like Etsy profile, so it's just turned on by default for everybody. But be that as it may. Okay, so yeah, so you get this hybrid file. So now, let's suppose I start up another shell where hist time format isn't set, type in some commands, and then I exit. Now what does my bash history look like? You're right, it's banded. So you see a block with no timestamps, then you see the block with timestamps, and then you see another block with no timestamps. So yeah, the answer is that bash history is agnostic about it and is willing to support files that have timestamps on some entries and no timestamps on the other. Yeah, so when you run the history command, what you see is banded output, as it turns out, right? Where some of the things have legitimate timestamps that were stored in bash history, and some of them are, well, it's when I read bash history from disk, right? Which is also true, by the way, when you're doing memory analysis. If you look at it in memory, you see the same banding feature. So when the bash history file is read in from disk, if it gets timestamps, it will set the timestamps on the entries appropriately, and for the others, it's just shell load time. So you actually will see this banded behavior also brought into memory analysis as well. Yeah. So, this is my favorite. Okay, so hist file size is 500, which is the default. I've got hist time format, and I've entered at least 500 single line commands into the current shell. I then exit the shell, okay? So there are 500 brand new commands going into bash history, but hist time format is set. So the question is, how many commands get saved in bash history? Who says 250? Who says all 500? You're right. So it turns out that all 500 lines are saved, including the timestamps, right? Okay. So yeah, you actually do get, so setting hist time doesn't shorten the amount of commands that get saved in bash history. So that's a good thing. So how many lines long is your bash history file? 500 commands plus timestamps, how long is it? 1,000 lines, right? Wrong. It's actually 999 lines because there's a bug in bash that the initial timestamp comment gets truncated off. Yeah. Okay, yeah, so it's actually, it turns out that, the answer is the initial timestamp gets truncated due to a bug in bash, so it's one line less than you always expect it's going to be. Awesome. Okay, so there are a number of environment variables that control bash history and how it gets written, and these can be used for anti-forensics. Hist file is where bash history gets dropped. Normally it's $home.bash history, but as an anti-forensics technique, you can set it to dev null, which means it doesn't get written. Hist file size, of course, is the number of lines. We've already spoken about that. You can set hist file size to 0, right, truncating the bash history file. Hist size is the number of commands to remember, okay? So that impacts sort of your currently running shell. So, few more quick quiz questions before we have to wrap up on this one. So, think about what's going to happen in memory, and then what's going to happen when the bash history file finally gets written to disk. When I set hist file equal to dev null. So what do you think happens in memory when I type that command? Does it change the command history in the memory of the current shell? I see Phil shaking his head no. Phil's right. It doesn't impact the memory. But when you write bash history, any commands typed in the shell just go into dev null. Now, the current bash history file isn't changed, so there won't be any updates to it, but any commands that were in there are still there. But any new commands in this shell go to dev null and they're lost. Okay, this one's more interesting. What if I set hist file size equal to 0? What happens in memory? Anything? Nope, nothing, actually. It doesn't impact memory at all. What happens on disk? So this is one that really surprised me. It turns out that the minute you set hist file size to anything, the file is immediately truncated, right? So in the middle of your session, if I say export hist file size equal to 0, it immediately truncates the current bash history to 0 bytes, or 0 lines, which is interesting to me because it's the only time I can find in the life cycle of bash that the history file is updated not on shell exit, right? So yeah, so there's a hook in bash. The minute you set hist file size to anything, it immediately truncates it to that value, whatever it is, whether it's 0 or 10 or whatever, which was a little surprising to me. Okay, so what happens if you set hist size equal to 0? What happens in memory? It drops the entire history list right away. It immediately drops the history list in memory. And when the shell exits, it's going to truncate bash history to be 0 lines. So from an anti-forensics perspective, this is the one you want to do, right? Now, I will say that looking at the memory images that I was testing with, when you set hist size equal to 0, it drops the history list, but those commands are still floating around in the memory of that process. So the strings are still visible. I can run strings against that process and see the original commands. So that leads me to believe that it would be possible to write some sort of carver to pull those out of the process memory. I haven't sat down and actually tried to do that. But the data is still there, at least for some period of time. So you might be able to carve it even if somebody does this in their shell. But new commands won't be entered into the history list, so you can't pick up anything that they do after that. So everything is forgotten. So, all right, there we go. That was the quick and dirty version of that presentation. The slides are available at the website you see at the bottom. 1 minute for questions.
So Hal, when you open up a shell session on a Linux machine and your bash history essentially is in memory, new commands are being edited, things are being written back, and you open a second shell, using the second shell, you modify the contents and then close your session, and then
the first shell exits, right?
Yeah. Can you wind up with a situation where you've effectively been able to manually edit the contents of the bash history?
Yes.
By kind
so,
of like
so in that scenario, I'm Mr. Unsuspecting in shell number 1, and I've opened up my shell and I've read the contents of bash history. Then Mr. Evildoer in the second shell comes up, they edit the contents of bash history on disk, then exit their shell. That has no impact on the history that's currently loaded in the first shell. But when the first shell exits, the behavior of bash is to read in whatever's on disk, which is now the modified bash history, and then append new commands to that. So yes, the first shell will carry forward the malicious edits from the second shell, appending their new commands onto that. But yes, it will carry through like you're expecting. So yeah. One over here.
I actually just wanted Heather to run over here, but no. What about something like using screen?
Using what?
Screen.
Okay, well, okay, so yeah, so the question, what about screen? Well, each screen session is a separate bash shell. So it's just like running multiple windows in an X window environment. When it exits, it dumps any history that you've done in that particular screen window. So all of the rules we're talking about apply equally to that format as well. The thing about screen is that you can have these really long-running, persistent sessions that you just come back and reattach to that never exit, which means the commands from those sessions never get written to disk, and the only way to get them out is memory analysis, right? Okay, that's all we got time for. I'll be available all next couple days or right after now to talk more about this if you have questions. Thanks for listening.